Philosophical pessimism appears to have originated in the East, particularly within the religious framework of Buddhism. In the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, Gautama Buddha introduces the first noble truth, dukkha, or suffering, as the essential characteristic of existence. Now this, bhikkhu, is the noble truth of suffering. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, illness is suffering, death is suffering, union with what is displeasing is suffering, separation from what is pleasing is suffering, not to get what one wants is suffering. In brief, the five aggregates subject to clinging are suffering. This concept likely influenced Greco-Roman philosophy from the Ptolemaic period onward, especially the pessimistic views of Hegesias of Cyrene. Jean-Marie Guiot, during the debate on German pessimism, 1870 to 1890, argued that Hegesias's philosophy echoed the pessimistic themes of Buddhism, which he considered a palliative of life. Guiot summarized this perspective. Most often, hope brings with it disappointment, enjoyment produces satiety and disgust. In life, the sum of sorrows is greater than that of pleasures. To seek happiness, or only pleasure, is therefore vain and contradictory, since in reality, one will always find a surplus of sorrows. What one must tend to is only to avoid sorrow. Now, in order to feel less sorrow, there is only one way. To make oneself indifferent to the pleasures themselves and to what produces them, to blunt sensitivity, to annihilate desire. Indifference, renunciation, here is thus the only palliative of life. The book of Ecclesiastes is a work of wisdom literature from the Old Testament. In chapter 1, the author reflects on the futility and meaninglessness of human endeavors. The words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem, meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. What do people gain from all their labors at which they toil under the sun? Generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun sets, and hurries back to where it rises. The wind blows to the south and turns to the north. Round and round it goes, ever returning on its course. All streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place the streams come from, there they return again. All things are wearisome, more than one can say. The eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear its fill of hearing. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. The author's pessimism is deeply tied to his reflections on death. Though he acknowledges wisdom as more valuable than folly, he believes that death renders this superiority meaningless, leading him to despise life. I saw that wisdom is better than folly, just as light is better than darkness. The wise have eyes in their heads, while the fool walks in the darkness. But I came to realize that the same fate overtakes them both. Then I said to myself, the fate of the fool will overtake me also. What then do I gain by being wise? I said to myself, this too is meaningless. For the wise, like the fool, will not be long remembered. The days have already come when both have been forgotten. Like the fool, the wise too must die. So I hated life, because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. In chapter 4, the author also expresses antinatalist thoughts, suggesting that those who have never been born are better off than both the living and the dead. Again I looked and saw all the oppression that was taking place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. Power was on the side of their oppressors, and they have no comforter. And I declared that the dead, who had already died, are happier than the living, who are still alive. But better than both is the one who has never been born, who has not seen the evil that is done under the sun. Some scholars have drawn parallels between the book of Ecclesiastes and an ancient Mesopotamian text known as the Dialogue of Pessimism, composed around 1500 BC. This text features a dialogue between a master and a slave, where the master's indecision and the subsequent cancellation of his orders drive the slave to despair, symbolizing the futility of human actions. In the Bible, Jesus also expressed doubts about the value of the world, as seen in the Gospel of John. If you belong to the world would love you as its own. Because you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Gnosticism, with its complex interweaving of Greco-Latin philosophy and religious thought, presents a profoundly pessimistic view of existence. Central to this belief system is the concept of gnosis, or spiritual knowledge, which is seen as the key to salvation. Unlike mainstream Christianity, which embraces the material world as God's creation, Gnosticism denigrates the earthly realm, viewing it as the flawed product of an evil or inferior power. The human body, within this framework, is perceived negatively, often described as a prison, tomb, or corpse that confines the true self, the spirit. To the Gnostic, the body is an alien entity, an unwanted companion that drags the soul down into the material world's corrupting influence. This view interprets the flesh as a state of suffering and degradation, the work of a demonic force that has ensnared humanity in a kind of living hell, the physical universe. The cosmos itself is viewed as a failed or even criminal creation, a place where souls are thrown and locked away without hope of escape. Gnosticism's grappling with the problem of evil leads to a dualistic worldview, where spirit and matter are in stark opposition. In some interpretations, an evil or inferior god, distinct from the transcendent and entirely good God, is responsible for creating the world and the physical bodies that inhabit it. This malevolent creator has trapped the divine spark within the human soul, extinguished in most but still faintly flickering in the chosen few. For these enlightened individuals, or pneumatics, the world is a prison, and their true home lies beyond the material realm. The Gnostics' pessimism extends to the very structure of the universe, which is seen as hermetically sealed and fortified against divine intervention. Descriptions of the cosmos often include imagery of outer darkness, a great sea, or an iron wall that prevents the soul's escape from the earthly realm. This barrier is not only physical but spiritual, as God himself is depicted as fortifying himself against the world's corruption. This sense of alienation and exile from the world drives the Gnostics' deep yearning for an afterlife, a return to the original homeland from which their soul has fallen. The upper part of the soul, considered a divine principle exiled on earth, experiences a profound nostalgia for its true origin. Salvation, for the Gnostic, is found through the recognition of this origin, gnosis, the knowledge that reveals the soul's divine nature and its separation from the material world. In contrast, those who lack this divine spark, or whose higher soul remains dormant, the hylics, which include the majority of humanity and all animals, are doomed to destruction or to an endless cycle of reincarnation, trapped within the confines of the material world. These souls, devoid of the light of gnosis, are condemned to wander in the darkness of ignorance, unable to break free from the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. Hegesias of Cyrene, a Greek philosopher born around 290 BC in Cyrene, Libya, was a key figure in the Cyrenaic school, which was rooted in both Socratic and hedonistic traditions. However, Hegesias significantly diverged from his predecessors through his radical philosophical pessimism. Although none of his writings have survived, his ideas are known through the accounts of others, particularly Diogenes Laertius, who famously dubbed him the advocate of suicide. Hegesias's philosophy is marked by the explicit denial of the possibility of achieving lasting happiness. In a manner reminiscent of later philosophical pessimists, he argued that true happiness is unattainable and that the most we can hope for is to minimize suffering. He believed that the human body, with its myriad sensations, and the mind's inevitable sympathy with the body's afflictions, made perfect happiness impossible. Furthermore, external circumstances, often beyond our control, continually disrupt our expectations, further distancing us from the ideal of happiness. Hegesias maintained that all external objects, events, and actions were ultimately indifferent to the wise person, including life and death itself. He asserted that while life might be preferable for the foolish, to the wise person, it is merely a matter of indifference. This radical stance on the insignificance of life and death is most famously encapsulated in his alleged work, Death by Starvation. According to Cicero, this book was so persuasive in its argument that death was preferable to life, that it reportedly led many readers to choose suicide. This advocacy for the desirability of death earned Hegesias the ominous nickname Death Persuader. Hegesias's influence was such that his teachings were seen as a threat to public order. His ideas, which could potentially drive people to suicide, were deemed dangerous enough that Ptolemy II Philadelphus, the ruler of Alexandria, banned Hegesias from teaching in the city. Despite this, his legacy endured, as a stark example of extreme philosophical pessimism, challenging the more optimistic views of human potential and happiness that were prevalent in other philosophical schools of the time. Al-Ma'ari and Omar Khayyam are two medieval poets renowned for their expression of a deeply pessimistic worldview. Al-Ma'ari, in particular, is noted for his antinatalist stance, arguing that it is better not to bring children into the world to spare them the inevitable pain and suffering that life entails. This perspective reflects a broader philosophical pessimism that pervades much of his poetry, where he questions the value of existence and the wisdom of perpetuating life. Similarly, the Spanish writer Baltasar Gracián explored themes of disillusionment and the futility of human pursuits in his works. His novel El Criticón, The Critic, is an extended allegory that portrays the human search for happiness as ultimately fruitless, offering a bleak and desolate view of the human condition. The novel reflects a deep skepticism about the possibility of finding true satisfaction or meaning in life on earth. Gracián's The Pocket Oracle and Art of Prudence further develops these themes by delving into the concept of desengano, often translated as disenchantment or disillusionment. However, this term carries a more nuanced meaning in Gracián's work, referring to the gradual loss of false beliefs about the world without necessarily abandoning the hope of finding truth or wisdom. As Jennifer A. Hurt explains, Gracián believed that the things the world values are deceptive because they appear solid and lasting, but are actually impermanent and transitory. Recognizing this, one should turn away from the pursuit of ephemeral pleasures and strive to grasp that which is enduring. Arthur Schopenhauer, the German philosopher, known for his own pessimistic philosophy, engaged deeply with Gracián's works. Schopenhauer held El Criticón in high regard, calling it absolutely unique, a book made for constant use, a companion for life, for those who wish to prosper in the great world. He saw in Gracián a kindred spirit whose aphoristic writing style, known as conceptismo, resonated with his own philosophical inclinations. Schopenhauer translated The Pocket Oracle and Art of Prudence into German and frequently quoted Gracián in his own writings, finding in his insights a profound reflection of the harsh realities of human existence. Gracián's influence on Schopenhauer contributed to the latter's development of a pessimistic worldview, which would later become a cornerstone of modern philosophical pessimism. Blaise Pascal approached pessimism from a distinctly Christian perspective, notably through his work Pensées, a collection of aphorisms that underscore the misery of the human condition with the intent of turning people toward the salvation offered by the Catholic Church and God. Though a brilliant mathematician and physicist, Pascal increasingly focused on religion and faith following a profound mystical experience at the age of 30. His embrace of Jansenism, a rigorous branch of Catholicism, led him to the belief that humanity is condemned to perpetual misery due to original sin. This misery, Pascal argued, is something we relentlessly try to escape. Being unable to cure death, wretchedness, and ignorance, men have decided, in order to be happy, not to think about such things. In our attempts to forget our condition, Pascal observed, we immerse ourselves in trivial matters, and engage in countless distractions, which he referred to as diversion. This concept of diversion, according to Pascal, encompasses a wide range of activities that keep us preoccupied and away from contemplating our finite existence and ultimate dependence on God. Pascal believed that a life focused solely on these distractions is one that leads away from God and true understanding. For Pascal, diversion is paradoxically both a source of temporary consolation and the greatest of our miseries. He contended that while action, often driven by these distractions, is bound to diversion, true dignity and purpose reside in thought. However, the thought that Pascal extolled is not that of scientific inquiry or philosophical speculation, which he believed often stemmed from pride and led people further from God. Instead, it is the introspective contemplation of our own finitude, a reflection that reveals our inherent limitations and brings us closer to God. In his famous maxim, man is only a reed, the weakest in nature, but he is a thinking reed, Pascal encapsulates his view that while humanity is fragile and insignificant in the vastness of the universe, it is through thought, particularly the recognition of our own mortality and dependence on the divine, that we attain greatness. This recognition does not inflate human pride but rather humbles us, helping us to see our true place in the cosmos and the futility of the pursuit of happiness on our own terms. In this way, Pascal asserts that recognizing our impotence and renouncing the illusory quest for happiness are the very things that can elevate us, giving our existence a sense of dignity rooted in the divine. In response to the devastating 1755 Lisbon earthquake, Voltaire published the poem on the Lisbon disaster in 1756. This work marked a significant shift in Voltaire's philosophical outlook, as it served as a direct critique of Alexander Pope's optimistic assertion in an essay on man that whatever is right. While Voltaire had initially admired Pope's poem, he later grew critical of its optimistic worldview, especially in light of the overwhelming suffering caused by natural disasters like the Lisbon earthquake. In the poem, Voltaire expresses a deeply pessimistic view of humanity's condition and the nature of God. The poem grapples with the apparent contradiction between the existence of widespread suffering and the idea of a benevolent, all-powerful deity. Voltaire questions how such devastating events could be reconciled with the notion that a just and loving God governs the world. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in response to Voltaire's poem, wrote a letter to Voltaire arguing that all human ills are the result of human faults. Rousseau's position suggested that much of the suffering in the world could be attributed to human error and moral failings, rather than to the natural order or divine will. Voltaire became the first European thinker to be labeled a pessimist by his critics, particularly after the publication of his satirical novel Candide in 1759. Candide is a pointed refutation of the Leibnizian theistic optimism, which famously holds that we live in the best of all possible worlds. Through the misadventures of his protagonist, Voltaire exposes the absurdity and cruelty of this belief, demonstrating instead a world rife with suffering, injustice, and irrationality. Though Voltaire was a deist, believing in a non-interventionist creator, he used Candide to argue against the existence of a compassionate personal God. He did so by focusing on the problem of evil, highlighting the stark contrast between the idealized, optimistic vision of the world and the harsh realities of human suffering. Giacomo Leopardi, though less known outside of Italy, was a profoundly influential figure in the 19th century, particularly impacting thinkers like Arthur Schopenhauer and Friedrich Nietzsche. Leopardi's work is characterized by a darkly comic view of life, often depicted as a cosmic joke or a divine mistake. His essays, aphorisms, fables, and parables explore the inherent contradictions in human existence, particularly the insatiable human desire for pleasure and the inevitable dissatisfaction that follows. Leopardi believed that humans possess an infinite desire for pleasure, yet no specific joy or pleasure can ever fully satisfy this longing. This is because every pleasure, being finite, falls short of the infinite craving inherent in the human soul. He articulates this existential dilemma by stating, the sense of the nothingness of all things, the inadequacy of every pleasure to fill our spirit, and our tendency toward an infinite that we do not understand stems perhaps from a cause more material than spiritual. The human soul, and indeed all living beings, constantly desires pleasure or happiness. This desire is boundless, as it is intrinsic to existence itself. No particular pleasure, which is finite, can satisfy it, and it can only cease when life ends. This desire knows no limits in either duration or extent, but since everything in the world has boundaries, no pleasure can ever match this infinite craving. Contrary to the long-standing Socratic tradition, which associates wisdom and knowledge with happiness, a view rooted in Plato's dialogues, Leopardi contends that philosophy, far from leading to happiness, actually reveals truths that are detrimental to human contentment. He challenges the notion that human perfection lies in the knowledge of truth and that all human suffering stems from false beliefs and ignorance. Leopardi argues, those who claim that human perfection consists in the knowledge of truth and that all our ills come from false opinions and ignorance are gravely mistaken. Equally misguided are those who believe that the human race will finally be happy when most people know the truth and organize their lives according to it. Leopardi's philosophical journey leads to a paradoxical conclusion. The ultimate lesson of philosophy is that we should not philosophize. Yet, this conclusion is both tragic and ironic, for once a person has embarked on the path of philosophical inquiry, they cannot simply abandon it. He observes, it is not within human power to forget the truths they have learned, and it is easier to cast aside any other habit than that of philosophizing. In essence, philosophy begins with the promise to cure our ills but ends up futilely seeking a remedy for itself. These insights reflect a deep skepticism about the capacity of reason and knowledge to bring fulfillment. Giacomo Leopardi's worldview was deeply shaped by his perception of nature as inherently hostile to the well-being of humanity and all living creatures. In his dialogue between nature and an Icelander, Leopardi presents nature as an indifferent and even antagonistic force. The Icelander in the dialogue recounts his futile attempts to escape suffering, only to be relentlessly pursued by the harsh realities of existence: extreme weather, natural disasters, predatory animals, diseases, and the inevitable decay of aging. In a climactic moment, the Icelander confronts nature, asking, for whose pleasure and service is this wretched life of the world maintained, by the suffering and death of all the beings which compose it? Nature, rather than providing a direct answer, instead orchestrates the arrival of 2 starving lions, who devour the Icelander, ensuring their own survival for another day. This grim conclusion underscores Leopardi's view of the natural world as a perpetual cycle of suffering and death, devoid of any higher purpose or benevolent design. Leopardi's response to this bleak understanding of existence was not one of resignation, but rather of courageous confrontation. He advocated for living life with a sense of vitality and boldness, despite the inherent suffering and uncertainty that it entails. For Leopardi, it was precisely the uncertainty and risk in life that made it valuable and exciting, even though they did not eliminate suffering. Instead of pursuing the elusive and ultimately futile goal of happiness, he suggested embracing life's inherent risks and uncertainties as a way to infuse it with meaning. Leopardi illustrated this idea with the example of Christopher Columbus, who embarked on a perilous and uncertain voyage. It was through facing these dangers that Columbus grew to appreciate life more deeply, finding value not in the security of success, but in the very act of risking everything in pursuit of something greater. This adventurous spirit, according to Leopardi, allows individuals to live fully, even in the face of inevitable suffering and disappointment. Moreover, Leopardi celebrated the human capacity to find humor in the absurdity of their condition as a powerful tool for coping with life's harsh realities. He believed that laughter, when born out of courage and a deep understanding of life's futility, grants a certain mastery over the world. He famously remarked, "He who has the courage to laugh is master of the world, much like him who is prepared to die." In this way, laughter becomes a form of defiance against the cruel indifference of nature, and a means of asserting one's dignity in the face of an uncaring universe. Although the roots of philosophical pessimism can be traced back to antiquity, it wasn't until the second half of the 19th century in Germany that it was systematically explored and rigorously debated. For nearly 5 decades, the issue of pessimism was a central topic in the context of what became known as Weltschmerz, or world weariness. This period, often referred to as the pessimism controversy, saw German philosophical discourse dominated by discussions of the negative value of existence, which became the focal point of intense intellectual debate. Arthur Schopenhauer, a key figure in this movement, was the first philosopher to present pessimism in a comprehensive and systematic way, underpinned by a detailed metaphysical structure. Schopenhauer's pessimism emerged from his analysis of life as the product of a relentless, insatiable cosmic will. He conceptualized the will as the ultimate metaphysical force, a restless and aimless striving that pervades both the inorganic and organic realms. This will, according to Schopenhauer, can be most directly understood by observing our own bodies and desires, as they are the most immediate manifestations of this incessant drive. Schopenhauer described the essence of the will as an endless cycle of striving without rest or ultimate goal. He argued that this ceaseless striving is the fundamental nature of all life, and that the foundation of all willing is a state of need, lack, and consequently pain. He observed, "When we examine nature, particularly the parts devoid of cognition, we see its inner essence as a continual striving, without goal and without rest. This becomes even more apparent when we turn to animals and humans, whose entire essence is defined by willing and striving, akin to an unquenchable thirst. The core of all willing is need, a deficiency that inevitably leads to pain. Yet, when the will's objects are too easily achieved and there is nothing left to strive for, it is engulfed by an unbearable emptiness and boredom. In essence, life oscillates like a pendulum between pain and boredom, which are the fundamental components of our existence. This concept has been poetically expressed in the idea that after all suffering was placed in hell, heaven was left with nothing but boredom. Schopenhauer viewed human reason as fundamentally weak and inconsequential compared to the driving force of the will. He used a metaphor to illustrate this concept. He likened human intellect to a sighted, but lame man who is carried on the shoulders of a powerful, yet blind man, the will. In this analogy, while the intellect can see and direct, it is ultimately dependent on the will's strength and direction. Schopenhauer observed that once desires are fulfilled, the satisfaction derived is fleeting, quickly giving way to new desires. This cycle of unending striving means that humans spend most of their lives perpetually pursuing goals, rather than experiencing lasting contentment. Even when satisfaction is achieved, and does not immediately give rise to new desires, it often leads to boredom. Schopenhauer posited that this boredom is a clear indicator of the intrinsic lack of value in existence. Boredom represents the realization of life's emptiness. If existence held any inherent value, we would not experience boredom. Mere existence would be fulfilling on its own, and we would lack for nothing. Moreover, Schopenhauer believed that life's struggle extends beyond mere dissatisfaction and boredom. He argued that biological existence is characterized by a relentless conflict, where every entity competes with others for survival. This universal struggle is vividly apparent in the animal kingdom, where each creature preys on another to sustain itself, and each species depends on others for sustenance, perpetuating a cycle of predation and survival. The will to live perpetually feeds on itself through this constant struggle. This struggle continues in the human realm, where it manifests in the harshest forms, revealing humanity's own brutal nature in its interactions. Schopenhauer also argued that pleasure and pain are fundamentally asymmetrical. Pleasure, he contended, is inherently negative, existing only as the relief from previous pain or want. Pain, on the other hand, is a direct and immediate experience. Thus, pleasure is not an inherent or original state but rather a temporary reprieve from discomfort. Pleasure, or what we commonly call happiness, is essentially negative. It does not arise independently but is always the result of relieving some prior pain or desire. Once a desire is satisfied, the pleasure derived is transient and soon replaced by new desires. Therefore, satisfaction or happiness can only be understood as the cessation of previous needs. Pain, however, is immediately experienced and directly perceived, making it the more fundamental condition of existence. Schopenhauer's views on old age and death reflect his broader pessimistic outlook on life. He regarded the inevitability of aging and death as nature's own way of condemning each individual manifestation of the will to live. In his view, the very fact that life ends in non-existence reveals the ultimate futility and emptiness of all striving. If existence were inherently valuable or absolute, he argued, it would not conclude in annihilation. Consider the stark contrast between the beginning and the end of our lives. We start with the fervor of desire and the ecstasy of sensual pleasures, yet end in the decay of our bodies and the stench of death. The journey from birth to death is a descent in terms of well-being and life's joys, from the blissful dreams of childhood to the carefree days of youth, the arduous toil of adulthood, the frailty and often pitiful state of old age, the torment of final illness, and finally, the agony of death. Doesn't it seem as though life is a grave mistake, the consequences of which become increasingly apparent as time goes on? However, Schopenhauer believed that art provided a temporary escape from the relentless cycle of striving. He argued that in moments of artistic contemplation, individuals could momentarily lose themselves and sublimate the will. In this state, one could transcend the ceaseless desires that characterize ordinary life. Yet, for Schopenhauer, True liberation from the will could only be achieved through a more radical approach, an ascetic life. He saw asceticism, which he interpreted as the mortification of the will or the negation of the will to life, as the only genuine path to freedom. This approach, practiced by Eastern monastics and the saints and ascetics of various traditions, involved renouncing worldly desires and striving to reach a state of willlessness. Although Schopenhauer never used the term pessimism to label his philosophy, he did not reject it when others applied the term to his thought. His philosophy has also been described using terms like voluntarism and irrationalism, though these were not labels he used himself. Despite the absence of these labels in his own writings, they have become associated with his work due to his emphasis on the primacy of the will and the irrational nature of human existence. Schopenhauer's ideas remain a cornerstone of philosophical pessimism, highlighting the inherent suffering and futility in the human condition, while also offering a potential path to transcendence through the renunciation of desire. During the final years of Schopenhauer's life and the subsequent years after his death, Post-Schopenhaurian pessimism emerged as a significant intellectual trend in 19th century Germany. Despite its growing popularity, this brand of pessimism was met with hostility by other dominant philosophical movements of the time, such as Hegelianism, materialism, neo-Kantianism, and the burgeoning positivism. In an era marked by revolutionary fervor and scientific discovery, the pessimistic worldview, often characterized by resignation and a rejection of progress, was seen as a hindrance to societal development. In response to these critiques, a group of philosophers deeply influenced by Schopenhauer, many of whom had personal connections to him, began to develop their own versions of pessimism, each adapting Schopenhauer's ideas in unique ways. Thinkers like Julius Bahnsen, Eduard von Hartmann, Philipp Mainländer, and others played a crucial role in transforming Schopenhauer's transcendental idealism into what Frederick C. Beiser refers to as transcendental realism. While transcendental idealism posits that humans can only know the appearances of things, not the things in themselves, transcendental realism asserts that the knowledge we gain from experience provides us with insights into the nature of things in themselves. This shift allowed Schopenhauer's bleak observations about the world to be considered as objective and noble truths, thereby solidifying the certainty of pessimism, the notion that non-existence is preferable to existence. The post-Schopenhauerian philosophers inherited two key premises from Schopenhauer: the metaphysical reality of the will, and the belief that existence is ultimately not worth its inherent suffering. From this foundation, each thinker developed their own negative outlook on being. Some, like Julius Frauenstadt and Eduard von Hartmann, sought to address the criticisms of pessimism by incorporating elements of historicism, acknowledging the validity of social progress within their philosophical frameworks. Von Hartmann, in particular, gave transcendental realism a distinctive twist, which his wife, Agnes Taubert, expanded upon in her work Pessimism and Its Opponents. Taubert defined pessimism as an empirical assessment of the eudaimonological value of life, essentially, determining whether existence is preferable to non-existence. She argued, like her husband, that this evaluation could be empirically verified. Olga Plumacher, another prominent figure in this intellectual movement, critiqued Schopenhauer's pessimism for not fully realizing its potential, arguing that it was inferior to von Hartmann's more progressive interpretation, which allowed for some degree of social advancement. However, don't confuse this for something positive. This social advancement is presented in the pessimistic sense, and we'll explore this later in the video. Meanwhile, Julius Bahnsen redefined the understanding of pessimism altogether, while Philipp Mainländer took a more radical approach by reinterpreting the nature of the will. Mainländer proposed that the will was inherently self-destructive, driven by a will to death rather than a will to life, as Schopenhauer had suggested. Julius Bahnsen's pessimistic outlook represents one of the most extreme and uncompromising forms of philosophical pessimism, arguably surpassing even Philipp Mainländer's in its severity. Bahnsen rejected any possibility of redemption, salvation, or escape from the inherent suffering of existence. He was deeply skeptical of the traditional avenues proposed by earlier pessimists, such as art, asceticism, or culture, as means to transcend or mitigate the self-torment of the will. For Bahnsen, these offer no real respite from the agonies of life, which he saw as inescapable. At the core of Bahnsen's philosophy lies the concept of the will, but unlike Schopenhauer, who saw the will as a singular, driving force behind all existence, Bahnsen viewed the will as inherently divided and self-contradictory. He described the will as willing what it does not will and not willing what it wills, highlighting the deep and fundamental conflict within the essence of being. This internal contradiction is, according to Bahnsen, the very heart of reality, and it results in perpetual self-torment. Bahnsen's philosophy is not merely a variation of Schopenhauer's ideas. It is also influenced by Hegel, though with a crucial difference. While Eduard von Hartmann, another post-Schopenhauerian pessimist, attempted to moderate Schopenhauer's pessimism by integrating Hegel's optimistic belief in historical progress, Bahnsen took a far darker approach. He adopted Hegel's dialectic method but focused exclusively on its negative aspect, its emphasis on contradiction. For Bahnsen, the dialectical process does not lead to synthesis or progress, as Hegel suggested, but instead to perpetual negation and destruction. He argued that history is not a linear or progressive development, but rather a cyclical process marked by constant conflict and contradiction. This view led Bahnsen to formulate his own idea of real dialectic, or real dialectic, which posits that in the struggle between opposing forces, there is no resolution or synthesis, only the annihilation of the contradicting elements. For Bahnsen, existence itself is irrational and devoid of any inherent meaning or purpose. There is no teleological power guiding the universe toward a higher end. Instead, the world is characterized by a ceaseless and senseless conflict that offers no hope of resolution. Julius Bahnsen's pessimism is intricately tied to his theory of tragedy, a direct consequence of the contradictory nature of his real dialectic. For Bahnsen, life is fundamentally tragic because it is riddled with irreconcilable conflicts between moral duties and values. In any given situation, especially in complex moral dilemmas, a person is inevitably forced to choose between conflicting principles. This means that whatever action one takes, it will involve the violation of some other equally important duty or value. This tragic conflict does not merely arise from a lack of clear moral absolutes, but from the existence of competing and incompatible conceptions of the good, each with its own significant and worthy countermotives. Friedrich C. Beiser, in his 2016 work Weltschmerz, Pessimism in German Philosophy, 1860 to 1900, encapsulates Bahnsen's theory of tragedy, with these words. For Bahnsen, the essence of tragedy lies in two fundamental facts. First, the individual is compelled to choose between conflicting duties or incommensurable values. And second, the individual must suffer for this choice, as fulfilling one duty or honoring one value inevitably comes at the expense of another. The tragic hero or heroine, in adhering to one moral imperative, must transgress another, and this transgression carries a price. Tragedy, then, is rooted in the inescapable reality that, even with the best intentions and a scrupulous conscience, we cannot avoid doing something wrong for which we must ultimately pay. In Bahnsen's view, this tragic condition of life is inescapable, and there is no path to redemption or resolution. The only solace, albeit a fleeting one, is found in humor. Humor, according to Bahnsen, offers a temporary escape by allowing us to laugh at the absurdity and contradictions of our predicament. Although it does not solve the inherent tragedies of existence, it provides a brief respite, a way to momentarily detach from the weight of our moral struggles. Much like Schopenhauer's notion of aesthetic contemplation through art, humor allows for a temporary abstraction from suffering. However, Bahnsen acknowledges that this relief is transient and does not offer any lasting solution to the suffering and moral conflicts that define human life. Humor, then, serves merely to lighten the burden and to steel ourselves for the inevitable challenges and tragedies that lie ahead. Philipp Mainländer's philosophy, particularly as articulated in his magnum opus The Philosophy of Redemption, stands as one of the most radical systems of pessimism in philosophical history. Published shortly before his suicide in 1876, Mainländer's work builds upon Schopenhauer's philosophical legacy but takes it in an even darker and more extreme direction. Theodor Lessing referred to it as perhaps the most radical system of pessimism known to philosophical literature, emphasizing its profound and uncompromising nature. Central to Mainlander's philosophy is the concept of the death of God, a notion that later resonates in Nietzsche's philosophy, although with a different metaphysical interpretation. For Mainlander, this concept is tied to the idea that God, in creating the world, effectively brought about his own annihilation. This act of divine self-negation sets the stage for the world as we know it, where the principle of existence is not a will to live, as Schopenhauer posited, but a will to death. This will to death is the inverted form of Schopenhauer's will to live and serves as the underlying force driving all existence. According to Mainlander, life itself holds no inherent value. Instead, the supreme principle of morality is the realization that non-being is preferable to being. This recognition ignites within individuals a transformation of their will to live into a will to death. In this view, the will to live is merely a tool employed by the will to death to achieve its ultimate goal, annihilation. Redemption, therefore, is found not in the perpetuation of life but in its cessation. The annihilation of the self and the return to non-existence is seen as the highest form of salvation. In contrast to Schopenhauer, who viewed individual wills as mere manifestations of a singular, all-encompassing will, Mainlander embraced a pluralistic conception of reality known as nominalism. This ontological pluralism posits that individual wills are finite and mortal. Their existence is both temporally and spatially limited. When an individual dies, their will is extinguished entirely, reducing it to nothingness. Unlike in Schopenhauer's metaphysics, where the disappearance of individual manifestations could not diminish the overarching will, Mainlander's pluralism allows for the complete annihilation of the will through the death of individuals. This metaphysical framework bestows death with an essential negative power, the power to erase the essence of the world, understood as the sum of all individual wills. Since Mainlander views non-being as superior to being, death becomes a significant benefit, offering eternal peace and tranquility. He refers to this ultimate state of non-existence as redemption, borrowing from the Christian lexicon. Indeed, Mainlander interprets Christianity, particularly in its mystical form, as a religion of renunciation and salvation, which he sees as an early revelation of his own philosophical views. In Mainlander's perspective, Christianity's emphasis on self-denial and the transcendence of worldly desires parallels his own philosophy's call for the renunciation of the will to live. This renunciation, culminating in death, is seen as the path to true redemption, a return to the nothingness from which all existence originally sprang. In rejecting the notion of a cosmic universal will that transcends individual wills, Mainlander asserts that knowledge is inherently immanent, empirical and representational, confined strictly to the content of individual consciousness. For him, each will is self-contained and isolated, both epistemologically and ontologically, with no overarching metaphysical unity, linking them together. However, Mainlander acknowledges a seeming contradiction. Natural sciences reveal that all beings in the world are systematically interconnected, suggesting that each entity depends on others, according to necessary laws. This interdependence appears to challenge the idea that each will is autonomous and self-enclosed. Mainlander resolves this paradox by introducing the dimension of time into his philosophy. He posits that, in the beginning, before time as we know it, there existed a singular, undivided unity. With the commencement of time, this original unity fragmented into multiplicity, initiating a process of division that continues to this day. This fragmentation, while giving rise to the interconnectedness observed in nature, does not negate the individual character of each will. The unity that once existed belongs to the past, and what remains is the divided, individualistic nature of reality. To illuminate this transition from unity to multiplicity, Mainlander introduces his tragic concept of the death of God. He proclaims in a prophetic and somber tone, "God has died, and his death was the life of the world." Mainlander interprets the figure of Christ in Christianity as an intuitive grasp of this cosmic truth. He envisions God, the original singularity, as a perfectly free and omnipotent being, who, upon realizing the limitations inherent in his own existence, becomes overwhelmed by anguish. God perceives that his current state of being is of negative value, less desirable than non-existence. Driven by this realization, he resolves to bring about his own end, not directly, which would be impossible, but through the creation of the world. By creating the cosmos and dividing it into countless individual entities, God sets in motion the process of his own self-destruction. This divine impulse towards self-annihilation, according to Mainländer, animates the entire cosmos. While the will to live may initially appear to dominate, it is ultimately the will to death that governs all existence. In the organic realm, for instance, the will to live is merely a mask for the underlying will to death, which eventually triumphs as all living beings inevitably perish. This trajectory from life to death is seen as the fulfillment of God's original desire for non-being. Mainländer extends this idea to all levels of existence, from the inorganic to the organic, arguing that everything is subject to a fatal process of cosmic annihilation. This process manifests physically as entropy and, in the realm of the living, as struggle and conflict. Mainländer views this progression as inescapable, likening it to a Greek tragedy where the fate one attempts to avoid is ultimately realized. In this grim cosmic drama, the entire world is nothing more than the rotting corpse of God, a decaying remnant of the divine impulse towards self-destruction that underlies all of existence. Eduard von Hartmann's philosophy, particularly as outlined in his seminal work Philosophy of the Unconscious, represents a distinctive synthesis of Schopenhauerian pessimism and Hegelian idealism. At the heart of his system is the concept of the unconscious, a metaphysical force that serves as both the irrational will and the rational idea. In von Hartmann's view, the world is created by the unconscious, primarily driven by the irrational will, which inevitably leads to a reality filled with suffering and evil. Unlike Hegel, who saw history as a rational process leading to the realization of freedom and self-consciousness, von Hartmann views the progress of history as the gradual recognition of the inherent misery of existence. The advancement of the idea, or reason, does not eliminate suffering but instead brings a deeper awareness of its inevitability. The culmination of this awareness, according to von Hartmann, is the realization that the only true escape from suffering is the collective negation of the will, a cosmic act of renunciation that would ultimately lead to the world's dissolution and the unconscious's return to a state of quiescence. Von Hartmann's pessimism, however, is not as absolute as Schopenhauer's. While he agrees that individual happiness is unattainable, both in this life and any possible afterlife, he does not advocate for the solitary, ascetic rejection of the world that Schopenhauer recommends. Instead, von Hartmann proposes that salvation lies in a collective social effort. He argues that humanity must go through a process of overcoming three fundamental illusions about the value of life. The illusion of present happiness. This is the belief that happiness can be found in the pleasures of the current world, a view that dominated ancient Greek thought. The illusion of future happiness, represented by Christian eschatology. This illusion transfers the hope of happiness to an afterlife, promising a better existence beyond this world. The illusion of progress. This modern belief in progress, especially in the power of science and social development to create a better future, is the last and perhaps most tenacious illusion. Von Hartmann contends that all these beliefs are ultimately futile. As humanity advances and these illusions are gradually dispelled, people will come to understand that the only true good is found in the peace of nirvana, which is synonymous with nothingness. The eventual goal, according to von Hartmann, is for a majority of humanity, enlightened by reason, to recognize the inherent misery of existence, and collectively will non-existence. This collective effort would lead to the dissolution of the world and a return to the primordial state of non-being. In this way, von Hartmann's vision of redemption involves not just the negation of the will on an individual level but on a cosmic scale, where the entire world is gradually willed into non-existence. This ultimate redemption of the unconscious forms the cornerstone of von Hartmann's ethical philosophy. He argues that while life must be affirmed provisionally, meaning we must engage in life and contribute to social evolution, we should do so with the understanding that ultimate happiness is unattainable. Instead of seeking personal happiness, which he deems impossible, individuals should focus on reducing the overall misery of existence through moral living. Von Hartmann opposes suicide and other forms of selfishness, advocating instead for a moral commitment to the betterment of society. By doing so, he believes, we can make life less unbearable, even as we work towards the ultimate goal of universal negation. Epistemologically, von Hartmann is a transcendental realist, meaning he believes that our knowledge, while conditioned by the structures of our minds, nonetheless corresponds to the actual nature of reality. His realism allows him to uphold the reality of time, which he sees as essential for the process of the world's redemption. Through time, the world moves inexorably towards the realization of the futility of existence and the final, collective negation of the will. Friedrich Nietzsche's approach to philosophical pessimism marks a radical departure from the more traditional forms of pessimism represented by thinkers like Schopenhauer. While Schopenhauer's pessimism culminates in resignation and a renunciation of life, Nietzsche introduces a life-affirming or Dionysian pessimism, which embraces the tragic aspects of existence not with despair, but with a profound affirmation of life itself. Nietzsche's Dionysian pessimism is rooted in his deep admiration for the pre-Socratic Greeks, particularly their tragic worldview, which he believed confronted the harsh realities of existence without retreating into the comfort of metaphysical or moral illusions. For Nietzsche, Greek tragedy, especially as embodied in the works of Aeschylus and Sophocles, revealed the fundamental truth of life as one of constant flux, suffering, and inevitable destruction. This tragic vision, far from leading to despair, was celebrated by the Greeks through their rituals and dramas as a powerful affirmation of life in all its chaotic and painful beauty. In stark contrast, Nietzsche criticizes the Socratic tradition, which he views as an optimistic escape from the tragic reality of existence. Socrates, with his belief in the power of reason to lead to happiness and virtue, represents for Nietzsche a turning point in Western thought, a movement away from the raw, honest acknowledgement of life's tragedies towards a more comfortable, but ultimately dishonest, belief in rational control and moral progress. Nietzsche sees this as a form of cowardice, an inability to face the true nature of existence, which leads to a devaluation of life and the emergence of nihilism. Nietzsche also rejects Schopenhauer's brand of pessimism, which he sees as similarly life-denying. Schopenhauer's pessimism judges life harshly, viewing it as an endless cycle of suffering driven by the irrational will. For Nietzsche, this moralistic condemnation of life leads to weakness and resignation, ultimately fostering a nihilistic worldview. In contrast, Nietzsche advocates for a pessimism of strength, a fearless acceptance of life's inherent suffering and chaos. This form of pessimism does not seek to escape from life's challenges, but rather to embrace them as essential aspects of existence that can be celebrated and affirmed. Central to Nietzsche's philosophy is the idea that the philosopher's role is to wield this pessimism of strength like a hammer, using it to deconstruct the old values and moral systems that have kept humanity shackled to illusions of permanence, meaning, and moral order. Nietzsche calls for a revaluation of all values, urging individuals to create new values that are life-affirming and rooted in a clear-eyed recognition of the world as it is, transient, unpredictable, and often brutal. A key aspect of Nietzsche's Dionysian pessimism is the concept of amor fati, the love of fate, which involves a joyful acceptance of everything that happens in life, including suffering and destruction. This acceptance is intimately tied to his doctrine of eternal recurrence, the idea that one should live as if every moment of one's life would be repeated infinitely. Embracing this notion means saying yes to life in its entirety, with all its hardships and uncertainties, rather than retreating into nihilism or despair. For Nietzsche, pessimism becomes a great liberation from the constraints of conventional morality and traditional values. It is an art of living that is good for one's health, a means of growing and thriving in the face of life's inherent struggles. By embracing the tragic and destructive aspects of existence with joy and strength, Nietzsche's pessimism offers a path to personal empowerment and creative vitality, challenging individuals to live fully and authentically in a world that offers no ultimate guarantees or final answers. Albert Camus' exploration of the absurd is deeply intertwined with the legacy of philosophical pessimism, yet it represents a distinctive approach that refuses to succumb to despair or nihilism, similar to Nietzsche's philosophy. While Camus acknowledges the inherent conflict between the human desire for meaning and the indifferent, chaotic nature of the universe, he does not advocate for resignation or escape. Instead, his philosophy centers on the idea of living in defiance of the absurd, a concept he vividly illustrates through the myth of Sisyphus. In the myth of Sisyphus, Camus presents the titular character, Sisyphus, as the quintessential symbol of the absurd hero. Condemned to an eternity of futile labor, Sisyphus is forced to push a massive boulder up a mountain, only to watch it roll back down each time he nears the summit. This endless cycle of effort and failure is emblematic of the human condition, where individuals persist in seeking purpose and coherence in a world that offers either. However, rather than viewing Sisyphus's plight as tragic or despairing, Camus argues that Sisyphus embodies the ultimate form of rebellion against the absurd. By continuing to push the boulder, with full awareness of its futility, Sisyphus transforms his punishment into an act of defiance and self-determination. Camus asserts that this defiant attitude, what he terms the absurd heroism, is the only authentic response to the absurdity of existence. He rejects both suicide and religious belief as forms of eluding the absurd, arguing that they represent an abandonment of true freedom. Suicide, for Camus, is a surrender to the absurd, an acceptance that life is not worth living. Religion, on the other hand, offers an illusory comfort by promising a higher meaning or afterlife, which distracts from the reality of the absurd. Instead of these escapes, Camus advocates for a life lived in full awareness of the absurd, embracing the lack of ultimate meaning and finding personal significance in the very act of living. This perspective, while rooted in pessimism about the possibility of finding inherent meaning in the world, paradoxically leads to a form of existential optimism. Camus' revolt against the absurd is not a call to despair but to a deep, personal engagement with life. It suggests that even in the face of an uncaring and incomprehensible universe, humans can create their own meaning through their actions, choices, and attitudes. The happiness of Sisyphus, therefore, lies in his conscious embrace of his fate and his refusal to be crushed by it. Peter Wessel Zapf's exploration of the human condition presents a profoundly bleak view of existence, one where consciousness, rather than being a gift, becomes a tragic burden. According to Zapffe, the evolution of human consciousness has led to an acute awareness of the terrifying and absurd nature of our existence. This heightened awareness forces humans to grapple with existential truths that are both horrifying and unavoidable: the inevitability of suffering and death, and the ultimate meaninglessness of life. Zapffe argues that this existential terror could easily overwhelm individuals, leading to what he describes as cosmic panic. To cope with this existential dread, Zapffe posits that humans unconsciously employ four main defense mechanisms: isolation, anchoring, distraction, and sublimation. These mechanisms serve to repress or mitigate the paralyzing awareness of life's absurdity and futility, allowing people to function in their day-to-day lives without succumbing to despair. Isolation involves the deliberate exclusion of distressing thoughts and emotions from conscious awareness. By refusing to acknowledge certain existential realities, individuals can avoid the anxiety they might otherwise provoke. This mechanism operates on both a personal and societal level, where uncomfortable truths about human existence are collectively ignored or suppressed. Anchoring is the process of finding or creating points of reference that give individuals a sense of stability and meaning. These anchors can be religious beliefs, moral codes, or cultural narratives that offer a sense of purpose and belonging. Zapffe argues that such anchors are essential for keeping the chaos of existence at bay, but they are ultimately artificial constructs that mask the underlying absurdity of life. Distraction is the constant engagement with activities and experiences that occupy the mind, preventing it from dwelling on existential concerns. Whether through work, entertainment, or social interaction, distraction keeps individuals' attention focused away from the deeper, unsettling aspects of life. This mechanism is perhaps the most pervasive in modern society, where people often immerse themselves in busyness to avoid confronting the void. Sublimation involves the transformation of existential angst into creative or intellectual endeavors. Through art, philosophy, and other forms of expression, individuals can channel their awareness of the absurd into something constructive or meaningful. While this mechanism allows for a certain degree of transcendence, Zapffe suggests that it is still, at its core, a form of repression, as it distances the individual from the raw reality of their condition. The concept of terror management theory, TMT, aligns with Zapfe's ideas, as it also centers on the notion that human beings must manage their existential anxiety. TMT, developed in the field of psychology, posits that the fear of death and the meaninglessness of life are fundamental sources of human anxiety. This anxiety is managed through the creation and maintenance of cultural worldviews that provide a sense of meaning, order, and permanence. These worldviews often promise some form of immortality, whether literal, as in religious beliefs, or symbolic, as in the legacy one leaves behind, thereby offering a buffer against the terror of mortality. Zapf's philosophy and TMT both underscore the precarious nature of human existence, suggesting that much of what people do, whether through repression, distraction, or the creation of meaning, is a response to the deep, often unconscious fear of the void. Yet, while TMT tends to focus on the psychological and social mechanisms that help individuals cope with this fear, Zapf's approach is more existential and philosophical, emphasizing the tragic irony of human consciousness and the inescapable awareness of life's absurdity. Emil Cioran's philosophy is deeply entrenched in the themes of despair, futility, and existential angst, yet it is also marked by a distinct style that eschews traditional philosophical discourse in favor of a more personal, reflective, and often paradoxical approach. His writing, characterized by aphorisms and short, potent expressions of thought, mirrors his belief in the futility of grand philosophical systems and the chaotic, contradictory nature of existence. Cioran's pessimism, while profound, is not nihilistic in the conventional sense. He does not advocate for complete despair or inaction, but instead offers a form of pessimism that is introspective and often laced with irony. His view of life as a failure of taste suggests a deeply ingrained dissatisfaction with existence, not merely as a series of unfortunate events but as a fundamental flaw in the very fabric of being. This sentiment is reflected in his aphorisms, where he distills complex existential reflections into brief, impactful statements, often contradictory, to capture the transient and elusive nature of truth. In his seminal work, The Trouble with Being Born, Cioran explores the existential dilemma of being thrust into a world without consent. He grapples with the absurdity of life, the inevitability of suffering, and the burden of consciousness, which makes humans acutely aware of their mortality and the futility of their endeavors. His exploration of antinatalism, the belief that it is better not to have been born, is succinctly captured in his statement, "We have lost, being born, as much as we shall lose dying. Everything." This aphorism reflects his view that life, from its very inception, is a process of loss, where the act of being born is itself a tragedy. Despite his bleak outlook, Cioran does not advocate for suicide as a solution to the problem of existence. He dismisses suicide as being just as meaningless as life itself, arguing that it is an act that, like life, ultimately lacks significance in a universe devoid of inherent meaning. Instead, Cioran views the contemplation of suicide as a potentially liberating exercise. By facing the idea of ending one's life, individuals might strip away illusions and confront the stark realities of existence, which could paradoxically lead them to live more authentically and with greater awareness of life's absurdities. Cioran's rejection of suicide and his embrace of life's inherent contradictions can be seen as a form of philosophical rebellion. He acknowledges the absurdity and suffering of life but refuses to escape it through death or denial. Instead, he opts for a life lived in full recognition of its futility, finding a kind of dark solace in the expression of this futility through his writing. His use of aphorisms, which allow for the expression of momentary truths rather than dogmatic decrees, reflects his belief in the impermanence and fluidity of understanding. Cioran's philosophy, therefore, is not one of resignation but of a relentless, albeit melancholic, engagement with the human condition. His work challenges readers to confront the uncomfortable truths of existence while also finding a peculiar kind of liberation in the acceptance of life's ultimate meaninglessness. Julio Cabrera's ontology posits that human life inherently possesses a structurally negative value. According to Cabrera, this negativity does not stem from specific events or circumstances in individual lives but from the fundamental nature of human existence itself. He terms this inherent negativity the terminality of being, characterized by several key aspects. From the moment of birth, Human existence is marked by a gradual decline. Life begins with a state of deterioration that progresses irreversibly, culminating eventually in death. This process of decay can unfold over a period ranging from mere minutes to approximately 100 years. Humans are subject to three primary forms of suffering. Physical pain. This includes illnesses, accidents, and natural disasters that humans are perpetually exposed to. Discouragement. This encompasses a range of emotional states from mild dissatisfaction, tedium vitae, to severe depression, reflecting a lack of will or spirit to continue. Social aggressions. Humans face and sometimes inflict various forms of harm, including gossip, slander, discrimination, and persecution, contributing to the overall suffering experienced. To combat these forms of suffering, humans develop mechanisms to create positive values: ethical, aesthetic, religious, recreational, and various personal achievements. These values are reactive and serve as palliatives rather than stemming from the intrinsic nature of life. They are generated through a continual and anxious struggle against the decay of life and its accompanying frictions. However, this struggle is inherently precarious and may be thwarted at any moment by these frictions or the progressive decline of one's being. Cabrera further argues that this situation is exacerbated by what he terms moral impediment. This concept refers to the structural impossibility of acting in the world without causing harm or manipulation to others. Moral impediment is not necessarily a reflection of personal moral failings but a consequence of the structural conditions humans find themselves in. In the pursuit of positive values, individuals operate within a constrained and anxious environment where they are continuously grappling with their deteriorating bodies, pain, and discouragement. This complex web of social interactions often leads to unintended harm to others who, like oneself, are striving to create their own positive values. David Benatar's arguments for antinatalism and philosophical pessimism are explored in his works Better Never to Have Been and The Human Predicament. He contends that procreation is morally indefensible and that a pessimistic view of existence is more realistic than an optimistic one. Benatar also clarifies that pessimism and nihilism are distinct concepts, with the latter not synonymous with the former. To support his pessimistic perspective, Benatar contrasts the nature of pleasure and pain in life. He observes that the most intense pleasures, such as orgasms, are fleeting, whereas the most severe pains can last for extended periods, days, months, or even years. The intensity of the worst pains often surpasses the joy derived from the best pleasures. Benatar poses a thought experiment asking whether one would prefer an hour of the greatest pleasures in exchange for an hour of the most extreme suffering, highlighting that severe pain outweighs even the most profound pleasure. The time it takes to fulfill desires can be long, and some desires may remain unfulfilled. The body is prone to quick injuries and illnesses, while recovery is often slow and sometimes incomplete. Chronic pain is prevalent, whereas chronic pleasure does not exist. Life involves a gradual decline in physical and mental health due to aging. Negative experiences come effortlessly, whereas obtaining positive outcomes requires significant effort. Human life lacks inherent meaning from a cosmic perspective. Benatar uses the term subspecie eternitatis to describe this lack of meaning from the standpoint of the universe. He concludes that even if suffering is thought to be necessary for appreciating the good in life, it is questionable whether such appreciation truly requires the extent of suffering we experience. He argues that life would be significantly improved if pain were brief and pleasure extended. The quality of pleasures were much greater than the severity of pains. Injuries and illnesses were rare and recovery swift. Desires were instantly fulfilled without creating new desires. We lived for thousands of years in good health and with greater wisdom, intelligence, and moral character. To address these issues, Benatar advocates for pragmatic pessimism, which involves engaging in activities that provide meaning on a terrestrial level, benefiting oneself, others, and animals. This approach allows for distraction from reality without denying it, in contrast to pragmatic optimism. In extreme cases, Benatar acknowledges that suicide might be a preferable option, but until such a point is reached, he recommends a response grounded in pragmatic pessimism. That's it for today. We examined the history of pessimistic philosophy. I just want to add shortly my take on how to deal with pessimism. All we want as human beings is escape negativity, and this is the driving force behind everything we do. We want to find happiness, but in my view, this is not possible. We can be happy for some short time, but eventually, usually sooner than later, misery returns. I can't escape negativity, and I don't want to. Even when I'm happy, I am aware of negativity that awaits me in the future. For this reason, we need to learn how to like negativity. I like everything that's the opposite of happiness. I don't want to be happy. I like being miserable. I am miserable out of spite. Even if something inside of me wants me to find happiness, I will ignore it on purpose, just for the sake of opposing it. I'm not going to be controlled by negativity, and I will gladly dwell in misery for the rest of my life on earth.